Much, Lisa, for the introduction, and I'm super excited to be here. It's a really big crowd, so a lot of interest in the development of affordable housing in your community, which is really inspiring. I am the Director of Regional Development. My region includes the North Coast, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Corridor, Metro Vancouver, and into the Fraser Valley. So I get quite a large portfolio in many communities to kind of see the differences. I've been working at BC Housing for 20 years in August, and have been Powell River has been in my region since I've started here. So I feel a deep affinity with Powell River. So really pleased to be here today. So when the provincial government launched significant new funding in four main areas. And so I'm going to go through those very big programs. I'm going to talk a little bit about what their goals are, where they fit into the continuum. I'll use some examples from your community. And then I'm open to questions. So I don't know, Lisa, if you wanted to do questions at the end or whether we're going to do it within the session, but I'm not shy, so please don't hesitate to stop me if people want to ask a question while I'm in the middle of the slide deck. Can I ask you to move to the next slide? So this is the housing ecosystem, as we've been calling it. And this is our big programs. And so Lisa's going to speak to the BC Builds part of the continuum. So moving from left to right, it's increasing increased a level of support on the left side of the continuum. So that's where we've got emergency shelter or supportive housing. And then we move through basic social housing, so deeply subsidized housing, perhaps. The middle of the continuum there is the rental assistance programs that we do have. We have several different ones. The two big ones that most people know about are the SAFER program, which is a legislative benefit for seniors, or the rental assistance program for families. And then we move through to the further the right side around basic affordable rental housing. And then that's where Lisa and I start to overlap a little bit, and then affordable home ownership in the private market. At the very bottom of the screen, you can see the provincial redevelopment program. So we're actually taking a number of our own provincially owned sites, so larger typically urban provincial sites, and redeveloping them. So moving forward with a significant increase in density on those sites. And what we're trying to do is create our own portfolio of housing and continuum on those sites. So using the density to be able to buy down some affordability on our own sites. And that program, we don't have a site in Powell River, but we do have many in other communities. If I can ask you to move to the next slide. So as I said, I'm going to be focusing mainly on the left side of that continuum. So the very big program that was announced by this current government in 2018 is called the Community Housing Fund. It was 14,000 units. The intention was to provide access to affordable rental housing. And it was that income was your only barrier, income or supply, were your only barrier to affordable housing. So this is straight independent housing for families, singles, or seniors. This does not come with any additional supports, but does come with significant subsidy. So it's intended to be for low to moderate income families. And on the screen, you'll see that it's very specific. It's very in terms of what its rental goals are. The large majority of the units are intended to be rent geared to income. And we look at what that income portfolio or profile looks like in your community. 30% of them are supposed to be at low end of market, or what your market is in Powell River. And then 20% of them are intended to be deeply subsidized. So that could be someone who is on income assistance, or could be a senior who has very limited access beyond just through OAS. These projects have been procured through a very large RFP process, so quite competitive and a very robust process. We've had 3 calls now. So 2018, there was another shovel-ready call after that, and then we just closed and announced in April our 3rd call. we have 2 more calls coming, so that's why I think this meeting is really critical and well timed of the municipality to organize because there is still more units to be allocated. So probably about 6,000 units still to be allocated. So roughly, I would say 3,000 units of calls still to come. You do have a community housing fund project in your community. It was successful with the Life Cycle Housing Society in the neighborhood of Cranberry. So that was a kind of a neat project that we partnered with that nonprofit, where they had 2 sites in a 3-site assembly. They had the 2 external sites, and the middle site was sterilized because it was owned by the province. The ministry at the time was Flinro. They've had some name changes, but I believe they're called now the Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship. And we helped facilitate the transfer of that site through the process, and we're able to give that to the nonprofit free of charge to be able to allow them to use the 3 sites together and increase, originally there were 8 units, and increase the density in that site to 24 units. That completed maybe earlier this year. And occupancy has proceeded. And it's a very beautiful project, and I'd love to see more like it in your community. What's really important to know about the Community Housing Fund is that it is a combination of grants and subsidy. So how the program works is the site has to be owned by a nonprofit and or municipality. So there has to be a nonprofit who's receiving the grants. So some scenarios outright, the life cycle project was owned by this society, but what could also happen is that a municipality can vend a site into the deal and then long-term lease that to a nonprofit so that we have the mortgageable interest. So that's really critical. Mortgageable interest is important. We don't have the money to pay for these types of projects all up front. So what BC Housing does is provide a grant, a per unit grant, to kind of buy down the mortgage for the construction costs and make it a little bit more manageable. And then the expectation is for nonprofits to secure the rental rates as per the slide and apply that to the mortgage and their operating costs. And everybody knows there's going to be a shortfall on that. Very few of these, if not any that I've seen, pencil out without significant amount of equity in addition. And so there's an ongoing subsidy in order to achieve that rental rate and to pay the mortgage. BC Housing is involved for 60 years. So this program is pretty gold plated to maintain that level of affordability and to maintain that housing for a good 60-year stretch. So that's how that program works. It's definitely a nonprofit-based program. As I said, we've moved through and are delivering the last of the original call of 2018 and the subsequent call in 2020. And now we're starting to launch the rest of the projects that were just allocated. We made a big announcement in April. If I could have the next slide. The Supportive Housing Fund, this is a program that requires provincial ownership. So this one is different in that sense. The way our money comes from Treasury is you either have an asset on the books or you have the cash still, or you have an asset. So we're not allowed to actually lose it. So this is definitely where we have strong partnerships with municipalities. Many of our supportive housing projects are either on our own sites we've purchased in a community, and or sites that have been vended into the deal by a municipality. That requirement does make the flexibility of providing supportive housing on nonprofit sites more challenging. Certainly, I won't lie, that is one of the flaws in the program and something that we have brought forward to the ministry. The latest round of supportive housing fund, it was replenished in budget 2023, still had the provincial requirements. So at this point, it makes it a bit more challenging for us. And the ownership test is not met by a nonprofit owning the site, leasing it to BC Housing, and then operating it. It has to be a separate partnership. So it could be owned by a municipality, leased to PRHC, and operated by a nonprofit. So that one is got some more specifics attached to it. The supportive housing fund is it is rental housing, so people do pay rent to live in supportive housing. It is governed by the Residential Tenancy Act, so sometimes people don't know that. That's quite important distinction. Specifically, BC Housing is tasked to work with adults. We don't provide supportive housing without MCFD's involvement for youth. So the program is intended for people who are 19 and over. This is a program that specifically targets people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. It's people who cannot live independently without some additional supports attached to them. And the program itself comes with a minimum of 2 24-hour staff. Day staff are significantly more than that, six at a minimum during the day. There is included in that program the intention to have a partnership with a health authority to ensure that referrals are made for appropriate services, whether they be primary care, mental health services, and or addiction support. What our goal around the supportive housing fund is to provide a housing first model. So we do accept folks that are still perhaps working on their mental health challenges and or are still in active substance use. It does require a significant amount of support dollars attached to it to ensure those people are well served. We typically would work with a local nonprofit. Our goal is to typically select an operator who has some knowledge of the community and the homeless population. And so while it wasn't originally funded under the program called Supportive Housing Fund, there is one supportive housing building in Powell River that is operated by Lived Community Services. And that was funded through the Rapid Response to Homelessness, but typically follows the same way. That's the supportive housing building on Joyce at Harvey. So this is definitely intended for communities that are experiencing high levels of homelessness. I'm sure I don't need to tell this room. They did have a very high point in time count this year with 139 people. And so certainly something to consider for your community, that the need for additional supportive housing. If I could ask you to move to the next slide. So this is the Women's Transition Housing Fund. The intended population in this program is women and children who are at risk or have experienced violence. And so what's really important about this is maybe a different population than we may have seen several decades ago. These are women who have significant barriers to housing, who are very vulnerable to violence because of some of the other situations in their lives. And so, as the slide says, BC Housing didn't always do the transition house program. That came to BC Housing in the last 20 years. And so the Women's Transition Housing Fund was the first time that program had been topped up in decades. And so it's really important. There's 3,000 units associated with the Women's Transition Housing Fund. The first phase in 2018 was 1,500, and then the province announced an additional 1,500 in budget 2023. So a significant investment in this client population. And we did see with the pandemic, there was a real increase in use of safe houses, transition housing as a result of the pandemic. So just some of the economic and pandemic stressors created an environment where there were significant uptake in those services. So the safe home is the sort of introduction potentially into the women's transition housing continuum. So as a 30-day stay, you're likely there on a very emergency related cause, and you're likely to be sharing it with other families. A transition house has a little bit longer of a stay, but certainly what we find is the previous program, how it was funded, did really favor having the safe home or the transition house, but really didn't build the rest of the continuum out. So our focus is certainly on more of the second stage housing and long-term permanent affordable rental for women and children, to be able to provide access for folks to be able to move out of those transition houses. Many of these women are economically challenged and are still trying to raise their children and maintain their children. We certainly want to create an environment where they have that process to be able to flow through. There is an active RFP. I think it's still open. Qualifying providers under this program. Again, this one is unfortunately a provincial program that we need to own the site. So it could be municipal site or we could purchase the site. Certainly have identified the Cathett region as in need of additional support for this program. And so really looking forward to hoping that your local nonprofit, I don't know if they're on the call or not, will respond to that RFP and come forward. This Friday, I'm going to meet with the Women's Transition Housing team to start identifying sites and regions. And so looking forward to being able to say that I believe Powell River is in need of this type of housing. What we're also looking to do is see if we can create some long-term housing through the program. Often we'll see a site that has a blended model, so second stage and long-term, to be able to allow women to stay in the same location. Next slide. The Indigenous Housing Fund, this is the last of the big 4 programs that we offer. This operates quite similar to the Community Housing Fund. So it's nonprofit or nation-based housing directly. So it could be a nonprofit site, could be a nation site. And it's specifically for Indigenous families, seniors, our elders. Again, it is a subsidy-based program, a combination of grant and repayable financing through subsidy. And so multiple different proponents are eligible under this fund. We just closed one in May. And so we're just finishing the final touches on our evaluations and hope to have an announcement coming out of the province by the end of July. So know that you have a really strong First Nation in your community to be able to respond to these types of RFPs. And so I'm hoping that I have good news for your community soon. So that could be on or off nation. So that's a really unique feature of the program. I just wanted to identify that BC is the only province that has actually funded direct housing on nation. And so instead of that being the jurisdiction of the federal government only, this government said we provide affordable housing for all British Columbians, including those who live on reserve, and so have worked since 2018 to figure out how that financing model works and have had some great successes. So the Indigenous Housing Fund has about 3,500 units in total. We've gone through almost the first 1,750 through the 2018 call. And this next call, we're going to fully allocate likely the rest of that program. So really big uptake, really interesting partnerships, really creative approach to doing housing. And so really, I think a really great new tool in our affordable housing kit to be able to address the overrepresentation of the Indigenous community in some of our housing counts. If I could move to the next slide. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we just touched a little bit. So I predominantly do new construction, but we do have a funding mechanism for existing affordable housing that's either owned by the province ourselves or that's owned by the nonprofit. And so we do have several legacy buildings in Powell River. So the life cycle housing on Ontario, we have the Powell River Inclusion that was created as well. So there are funding streams available to maintain and repair buildings. So while we do expect in your operating budget to have a replacement reserve that you set aside, we know that sometimes that's not enough. And I just wanted to touch base that the most important thing to do to maintain affordable housing is to address affordable housing is to not lose the stock that you do have. And so we do have a strong priority at BC Housing to also support nonprofits to maintain the housing that they do have, to ensure that it is being repaired, particularly also the goals around sustainability. So making sure that the housing is it's resilient and it's something that could be used going into the future. So I would have said there was a big significant switch at BC Housing around funding for various, I would say, climate initiatives, and most importantly around cooling. So typically we would have thought that that wouldn't have been a feature in a rental building, but now we're just finding, based on the data, that providing cooling in these buildings is really important. To be able to have them used into the future, as we've seen in the last few days with the heat wave. So that's just something that I want the nonprofits to know that they can take advantage of as well. Last slide. Yeah, so just always want to say, you've obviously shown an interest by coming to this session. So what is it that you can do if you're a municipality or you're part of the private sector or you're a nonprofit? And so while it's I think a requirement, Lisa, to do a housing needs assessment, I think it's also a great roadmap for a community to undertake that process and to find out what your needs are predominantly. The reason why these programs are important is to just make sure they're pretty prescriptive. They have a specific target, and then how can we align your needs as a community with what funding is available? Because I think that's really important to be able to know what's going to be a successful project. Another option that the private sector, nonprofits, is to identify or offer land into a project at nominal value. The benefit of creating or putting the land in at nominal value is that it just makes the project much more competitive, so that we're not actually paying for land at the same time as paying for all the construction costs. So something to think about is what land do you have in the community for affordable housing. Obviously, a municipality can waive fees to support affordability. It's great to see a broader partnership on these projects, not just the nonprofits in the province. The municipality can also look for ways of expediting your processes to help create housing more quickly. I'm not going to say I think that's not an issue in Powell River. You're a very nimble municipality. Some of our larger municipalities take a little bit longer to go through some of these processes. And then just it's really great to have Elizabeth Tang here as well from CMHC, just the idea of how we could all work together. So the 3 levels of government plus the private and or nonprofit sector. And then, just the important piece of continuing to build the capacity of the nonprofit sector here in Powell River to be able to take on these new exciting opportunities so that you can be successful in some of these competitive requests for proposals and build more affordable housing in your community. And that's all I have to say today.
Thank you, Naomi. That was really, really helpful. I see that we've got one question in the chat that I'll read out to you. And then I see Councillor Isaacson also has her hand up. So the question is curious about the Community Housing Fund restrictions to residents. This is preventing people from getting into housing in parts of the province. In what ways has BC Housing been flexible on those rules to allow roommates to get into secure rental housing? I'm not sure if you can tackle that, Naomi.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. I just want to clarify. So is it around the concept of occupancy limits around who can live in the building?
See, Lisa,
don't know what fund
restrictions
on residents.
Yeah, so you have restrictions on, the building is for families or singles or seniors. And then there's actively vacant 2-bedroom units sitting in a municipality in the province with people in the community looking to move in there, but they're roommates and they're not allowed to move into that building. So you've got BC Housing funded units sitting empty and people not being able to move into them.
Yeah, so we rely on the national occupancy standards, which would indicate if you're not related individuals, you can't live together. But I will flag that, Lisa, for our program planning team, because that's certainly not the intent. And I do think you're accurate in a way that, the makeup of families is changing. How people want to live is changing. And so we should probably, look to how people are arranging their lives and their residences. So that's a great point. And let me bring it back on your behalf.
Thanks.
And Councillor Isaacson.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So Naomi, I think we have a number of community needs in Pell River, and so I'm wondering if you could speak to the possibility or the limitations of flexibility in combining different housing types or housing with other community services such as childcare or primary care clinic. I feel like sometimes we have land and we want to maximize it, and so having something specific to one purpose limits what can be possible. We don't necessarily need 50 units of one type. We need a mix to serve different populations, and being able to mix purposes would be really helpful. And I think sometimes nonprofits bump up against restrictions in that area. Could you speak to the opportunities there, or
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And if a municipality is going to vend a site in, I can see why you'd want to maximize the use of that site for that. So the easy one is childcare. So we have an existing partnership with the Ministry of Education and Childcare around the inclusion of childcare in our CHF projects predominantly. Could be also Women's Transition House Fund projects, Trina. The big piece is not the collaboration on the funding. So I'm fairly certain we have multiple projects that we've been successful in getting the capital funding and the operating funding. It's around the operator, making sure you have an operator. So what does that look like in terms of you have a residential operator, and then how do you secure a childcare operator? They're often not the same people. So if you're applying to a competitive proposal call, it's making sure that all those little things are already buttoned up, right? So what I'm looking for is what's the risk here? So you're proposing a building that has a whole ton of shelf space, but we don't have the childcare funding identified yet. We have no support from MECC, and we have no operator for it. So I would say the more capable you are of kind of putting it together and making it seem like, bringing those partners together and showing how you could make it work. I think we have multiple projects that have those sorts of creativity, but it takes more work, right? It's much easier to build one type of housing. So the next proposal call is likely early 2025, and I am able to talk to anybody up until that proposal call is live and help you kind of build that and make introductions if required, and start working on structure, Trina, like make suggestions on how something like this could work. The Women's Transition House Fund program requires us to have ownership, but we could certainly have a split use building where it's strata titled and an airspace parcel of units are owned by a nonprofit through the Community Housing Fund. We've got another airspace parcel that has a childcare in it, and another airspace parcel that has units that PRHC owns that are for women and their kids at risk of violence. So it's not impossible. We just the groundwork on how it would structure, I think, is the piece that we would need to work on, but I'm more than willing to make myself available for that.
Okay, thank you. So I think we're going to take one more question before we go to Lisa Helps, and then there'll be more time for questions at the end after Elizabeth. So Patty, would you like to, Patty Torgerson with Coastal Health, would you like to read out your question?
Sure. Hi. Hi, Naomi. I'm just wondering, just listening to the Community Housing Fund, how it's broken down, 30% market, 50% geared to income, and 20% deep subsidy. We have an urgent homelessness response team here through the Mental Health and Substance Use Services at Cathett General Hospital. And we have attempted to get people into life cycle housing who require subsidy, but the only units that are available are market housing, and there's no flexibility. And I'm wondering, is there a way to make it more flexible, so when we know we probably need 50% deep subsidy rather than 30% market, is there any way to make changes to that so that people can be housed, people who need the housing, when there's units sitting empty?
Yeah, so the community housing fund is very prescriptive. That's not something we can change. It's based on how much subsidy is required. So we're looking to kind of balance the needs of and also create a mixed income building so that we don't have one building that has a significant higher need that doesn't have the supports in place. So the supportive housing fund should actually be the vehicle for most of those folks who require additional supports. The 20% of the units are intended for people who might be ready to leave supportive housing and who could live more independently, maybe with a light touch of support from VCH that are more of an in-reach model or referral model. No, but the actual percentages can't change. You have a really small project in Powell River with 24 units that were funded through the community housing fund, right? So you're going to have quite a low amount of supportive housing, and they did have existing tenants they needed to make commitments to move back in. So I think, Patty, if there were a larger CHF project, it would give you more access to those 20% units.
But nothing to be done if those units sit empty and don't get rented?
So I am not on the operating side, but I do not want to hear that there are units that are sitting empty. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just curious.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Naomi. And I know we have you for a little bit longer, so really appreciate the information you shared. And if I could turn over to Lisa. Lisa, are you able to share your screen, or let us know if you need Caitlin to share your PowerPoint?
Yeah, we don't have a lit up share button either. So if Caitlin could share it, that would be awesome. And it was great that you asked us to send them over in advance for exactly this reason. So yeah, you can bring it up.
Thank you. Getting used to Teams and making sure that as a moderator, I'm not exactly an expert. So I'm glad we went with some backups.
That's great. So thanks for the opportunity. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, Lisa, Bhopal Singh, we can make them presenters if that helps, so that they have control.
Thank you. I actually thought we did that yesterday through IT. So I'm not sure quite why it hasn't worked out, but if you're able to do it on your end, because somehow you became a presenter too, Councillor Isaacson.
It's okay. I don't think I'm happy to just say next slide, please, if that works.
Okay.
The deck is up there. So thanks for the invitation and having me here this morning. And yeah, great to see such a turnout. This is wonderful. Before I start, I would just like to root myself where I am here, which is on Lekwungen territory, the homelands of the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. And I'm here on Lekwungen lands in the city of Victoria, but also a recognition that wherever we're building housing across the province, it's always on Indigenous land. And so that's just, I think housing is sometimes through the Indigenous Housing Fund that Naomi mentioned, and also through BC Builds, which I'll talk about, an opportunity for reconciliation, as well as always acknowledging the lands where we are. So I'm going to go through the presentation. I can do this in 10 minutes. I can do it in 35 minutes. I'm going to take the probably the 17-minute version and leave lots of time for questions afterwards. So if we can go to the next slide, and then. Oh yeah, and it's a PDF, so you have to just click. There we go, next one. And then just about BC Builds, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so Naomi alluded to this already, but BC Builds picks up where the rest of the BC housing programs, which she really profiled so well for all of you, leaves off. So BC Builds is not an affordable housing program. It's a rental supply program, and the aim is to intervene in a very difficult situation just in terms of the cost of construction, which is made more difficult by the cost of land, actual construction costs, high interest rates, high labor costs, etc. So BC Builds was designed and developed to intervene specifically at a time when construction costs are high, and at the same time where in all communities across the province, large and small, middle income workers like our teachers and nurses and construction workers and small business owners and transit operators and paramedics and all those folks who make a half decent salary but still can't find a place to rent because there aren't places for them to rent, are having a hard time in communities. And so BC Builds was designed specifically to intervene in those two ways: high construction cost environment and and middle income folks across the province having difficulty finding places to rent. And again, it's not because they can't afford them necessarily, it's just because there isn't simply enough of the kind of housing that they need in communities. So let's go to the next slide. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how BC Builds works, and then I'm going to tell you who BC Builds works for, and then I'm going to show you some sample projects, and then I'm going to tell you about what we like to think of as the BC Builds difference, and then I will outline what I think is one of our most exciting opportunities, which is our Housing Development Opportunities platform. But first, how BC Builds works. So we do three main things. First, we identify low-cost land for development. And this is really an exciting part of the work. We are very happy, obviously, to partner with existing housing providers who may want to add more density or redevelop their sites. And kind of our larger focus and bigger target audience, if you will, are community, government, and nonprofit landowners who may have land, who may not be in the housing business, and who may want to use their land for housing. We also work with private landowners. I'm not going to talk too much about that today because it's a bit of a separate stream. With private landowners, if there are those of you here this morning, great. We need you in two ways. One, build homes on your land and come and see us for financing. So for private landowners with no nonprofits involved, we can provide low-cost construction financing, which is through the private stream. But the bread and butter of the public stream is looking for partners that have low-cost land. And then that middle part there, bringing together landowners, residential developers, and speeding up project timelines. So we built BC Build specifically around the needs of local governments and other landowners who may have land for housing, but don't have the capacity or the staff resources or the mandate for that matter to build housing. So that's us there in the middle, bringing everyone together. And then we can provide low-cost construction financing, low-cost takeout financing, and grants into projects that are owned and operated by nonprofits, public housing corporations, or First Nations-owned entities. And so that's kind of the nuts and bolts. Unlike the other programs that Naomi talked about, and this is really a really important distinction. BC Builds grants are simply meant to offset the cost of construction. There's no ongoing operating subsidy, and the buildings, the rents that people pay need to carry the costs of the building, both servicing the mortgage, the operating costs, and then setting aside a small capital reserve to maintain the building over time. Let's go to the next slide. And so this is how BC Builds works for you. Thanks for going right to the next slide, depending on the you. So our target audience to start is renters. You did see in Naomi's presentation, affordable home ownership. A previous program, the affordable home ownership program at BC Housing did have affordable home ownership opportunities. It was a very challenging program, very few homes actually built. And so BC Builds will in the future very likely develop a home ownership program, but for now we're focusing specifically on renters. I'm not going to read through this whole slide. I've already touched on nonprofits and private developers can both own and operate these units. The key though, and I'll talk more about this in the next slide. When we make grants to buildings, as I said, this is mostly a rental supply program, but we do make the grants so that even when a building opens, at least 20% of units need to be 20% below market. So we are trying to get some semblance of below market units in there with our grants. I've already talked about the who, middle income earners in the communities. And then I really want to just draw your attention to the middle income housing limits and be crystal clear that these are not the target household incomes that we are aiming for. We're not aiming to provide housing to households that make $131,000 who could rent a bachelor or a one bedroom. We're not aiming to provide housing to households that make $191,000 and could afford a two bedroom or less. We had to put the cap somewhere, and that cap is the 75th percentile of incomes across the province. So those are the very maximums. Households above that don't qualify. and with bringing together low-cost land, expediting development, bringing grants, bringing low-cost financing, our aim is to provide housing for households as far below those ceilings as possible. So I just didn't want to get people to get caught up on, wow, that's a really high income. It is in some ways, but that's not the target, it's the cap. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so as I noted, BC Builds also works with many of you folks on the call, government, nonprofit, and community landowners. And what we do is once a piece of land has been identified, we help to develop a vision for what can be done on that land, set some project goals, set some timelines. And this question was asked earlier about, what more can be done with public land other than just housing. So BC Builds really does have a mandate to maximize the use of public land. So we're always going to be looking for creative opportunities to add housing on existing sites and add housing and incorporate housing above new infrastructure. And I'll show you some of our sample projects. We're building housing on top of fire halls, on top of city halls, on top of Indigenous owned businesses and tribal headquarters, on top of neighborhood houses. So on top of childcares, whenever we can, because public land is a very valuable resource and should be put to the best and highest use, we're looking to incorporate as many not as many uses as possible, but a public use on the ground floor or community use on the ground floor with housing above. And then the third bullet there is a really important part of our service, and I'm going to show you the how a little bit later on, is help the landowner secure a developer, builder, and owner operator if necessary. And then the who list is just a sample. We're not restricted to that, but that's just a sample of the kinds of folks we're working with. Okay, next slide. And this slide is kind of the flip side of the previous slide, where our work with nonprofit, First Nations, and private developers and housing operators. So we make connections for these folks to available zone sites, help accelerate approvals to get projects moving quickly, and then working collaboratively with everyone involved to remove obstacles and again, speed to construction. The who is listed there. The grants are listed there. I'll just give a bit of a high-level overview about how the grants actually work. Again, the $225,000 per unit is a cap. Anything above that is not a viable BC Builds project, but we are not aiming to spend $225,000 per unit on projects. And the reason for that is that we want the very generous contribution that's been made by government to this program to build as many homes as possible across the province. And secondly, the grant amount is structured to achieve 20% of units at 20% below market when the building opens. And so what that means is just, for anyone who's wanting to understand this a little bit more, so say and I'm just using 100 units because it's easy to do the math. You're building a 100-unit building, and I actually know that's not that practical for Powell River, but for the sake of explaining it, you're building a 100-unit building. You calculate how much it's going to cost to build that building. You know how much the rents are going to need to be to cover the costs of the mortgage. And then you say, okay, how much is it going to be? How much more money would we need in operating if we drop 20% of the units to 20% below market? And then you have an equity gap, that you can't build the building and have 20% of units at 20% below market with the original amount. You're going to need more money if you want to lower rents. And so that's where the BC Builds grant comes in. Our grant is based on how much does it cost on a per unit basis to get 20% of units to 20% below market. Key point, that grant amount applies to all of the units in the building, not just the 20% of units at 20% below. So that's just, if you're thinking about how to work with BC Builds, don't try and aim for $225,000 per unit. That's not our goal. Our goal is how little can we spend to achieve 20% of units at 20% below market. One thing I'll say here before I move on to the next slide to show you some of the sample projects And I think this is a really important point. While BC Builds is a rental supply program aimed at middle income housing, because we're partnering and specifically giving grants to nonprofits, co-ops, public housing corporations, First Nations owned entities, we know that for many of those organizations, they're mission driven, they're in the business of providing non-market housing. And so over time, 10, 20, 30 years from now, as the building is paid off, as the mortgage is paid off, those extra savings don't go into pockets as profit. In most instances, they go to drop the rent over time. So the best example that I can give, and I think the one that really resonates is, everyone wants to live in co-op housing because it's so affordable, and particularly, in Vancouver, there's a lot of co-op housing. It was built in the 70s and 80s. Right now, it's so affordable. But when those co-ops opened, they were built for working people at rents that working people could afford. So very similar mandate with BC Builds. While it's a rental supply program to start, it's a long-term investment in the community housing sector and a long-term investment in affordable housing over time. And I think that's a really important distinction to make when you're thinking about, do we want to put our public land into BC Builds to provide homes for teachers and nurses? Some places are answering yes, some places are answering no. We have had a lot of interest. However, that's the short-term thinking, which is important to solve an immediate problem. But when you're thinking about the long-term benefits of partnering with BC Builds, it's really that affordability over time. All right, I'm going to keep going. I don't know how I'm doing with my 17-minute goal that I set for myself, but a few more slides to walk through. Just to give you some sample projects, I'm not going to read the slides for you. I'm happy to send we've already sent the slides, so Lisa, you can feel free to circulate them to everybody who's here and others who aren't here who might want them. This is a piece of land owned by the city of North Vancouver. The first 3 stories are a neighborhood house, so they're going to have seniors programs, childcare, youth programs. Their food bank runs out of there. They didn't just want to rebuild their neighborhood house, but they thought, what else can we do with our public land? And so through BC Builds and a partnership with Catalyst Developments, we're adding 179 homes that will be first come, first served to City of North Vancouver residents, and it's a mass timber building, which is a benefit. Next slide. Just like the Indigenous Housing Fund, BC Builds can work on and off reserve. So this is a project that we're doing with the Cowichan tribes and the Quatsin Development Corporation, which is fully owned by the nation, in Duncan on reserve, but in downtown Duncan. And this is a beautiful project that really demonstrates, I think, BC Builds as an economic reconciliation opportunity for nations. So they're building these 2 market buildings. Of course, they're going to be available to people who work and live as part of the nation. But also the nation really sees this as a service to the community of Duncan, because they're building in the Cowichan Hospital. The province is building a new hospital. The hospital workers are going to need housing. This building is being built in advance of the hospital, so that when the hospital opens, the nurses and others who will need to work there have housing. And this is a really beautiful partnership. And on the ground floor, tribal headquarters of the Cowichan tribes, below market space for Indigenous owned businesses, and then the housing above, again with Indigenous and non-Indigenous renters living together. And then next slide, I just wanted to show you a sample of a small project on the Sunshine Coast. This is in Gibsons, 33 units of housing above 24 childcare spaces. And again, Gibsons wanted to maximize the use of public land. And this one was a real miracle, because it was designed just for housing. And then Michelle Kirby from the government's childcare spaces fund came through and said to the mayor, hey, why don't you build childcare here as well? And so we quickly redesigned, or they did, but with our support, quickly redesigned the building from December of last year to January of this year, and managed to put childcare on the bottom. And it was originally going to be 36 units of housing, and we only lost 3 homes and had the benefit of adding childcare. So we're always looking for those opportunities. All right, next slide. I want to now tell you about the BC Builds difference. And this, I think, is part of the most exciting part of the work that we do. It's working differently. And at the top there, you can see, and many of you who might be in the business know how long it takes typically to take a project from we've got land to we've got our land under construction. And the linear process that is most often followed is laid out up top. What we do with BC Builds is because I guess we're kind of like a housing accelerator. We curate, convene, work together with everybody involved in the project from the outset. So somebody brings the land at $0. We immediately start work on the feasibility. We're building the partnerships at the same time. We're working with the municipality on the approvals process, and we're starting to line up the financing. And so we're putting all of these, and it's a bit chaotic, to be honest, at the beginning of every project. So, okay, all these folks are coming in at the same time when usually there's a sequence that happens. But it's great because municipal staff are learning about financing are learning about municipal approvals. All of us are learning to think in 3D with the architects. So, and the theory is that if we bring everyone together, we get this kind of machine going at the beginning, that we're going to be able to take projects from concept to construction in 12 to 18 months. On more complex projects with multiple partners and 400 units might take a little bit longer, but so far, even on the City of North Vancouver one, we started in earnest on that last summer, and they're looking to break ground this October. So it seems to be working, and that's part of the BC Builds difference in the BC Builds service. All right, let's just whip through the next few slides. I'd like to just tell you about our housing development opportunities page. And I think this is hopefully of interest to government, community, nonprofit landowners. So I talked earlier about matching zoned land with developers. When land is zoned, it's de-risked. And again, to help smaller landowners and particularly local governments, but also others who may wish to build housing but don't have the capacity. You say to us, please put this land up on our housing development opportunities platform. We do that. And if we can go to the next slide, it just gives you a sense of the platform itself. And all of these next slides are actually our website, so you can go and have a look at it. So we've got a map across the province. It shows all of the active opportunities. This is a bit out of date. Some of these have closed by now. The user can click onto any of these items, and let's go to the next slide and see in detail about the proposal itself. So the municipality will tell us what is the zoning, what is the permitted use, what would they like to see on this site, what are the next steps for development permit, et cetera, et cetera. Enough information for private sector developer builder to come and bring a proposal. They'll submit the proposal on a closing date that's designated by the municipality to BC Builds, and the municipality will co-evaluate the proposals based on very, very set criteria. So there's no room for nuance. So it's a fair and transparent process. And then go to the next slide. This is just a sample of what the property opportunity notice looks like with all the detail in it. And then the next slide, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. Again, this is all up on our website, but the thrust of it is that we have zoned land, we put it up, we co-evaluate the proposals. We all sign a conditional land contribution between BC Builds, the landowner, the developer, and the owner-operator if there is a nonprofit involved. In some cases, municipalities already have selected a nonprofit owner-operator beforehand. In other cases, they haven't. So we all sign a letter once the proponent's selected, and we say, okay, we've got a year now to get this from here we are together to let's get this under construction. And we all make commitments as to what we're going to do in that year to make that happen. Want to stress very clearly, we're not asking anybody to give away their land. We recommend structuring all of the deals as a long-term lease. So at the end of the day, whether it's a municipally owned site or health authority owned site or school district owned site or church owned site, that the landowner is still the landowner at the end of the day. So I'll leave it there. I know that was a lot of information. Thankfully, this has been recorded. So if I went too quickly or there's anything you want to go back to, you can. But in the meantime, I'm very happy to take your questions.
Lisa, thank you so much. Again, like Naomi, that was a lot of very practical information. I know we have you for about another 20 minutes. So I see that we have one question specifically here that maybe I'll kick off with. Kathleen, I think you asked the question, is new prefab housing eligible for BC Build supports?
Yes, Kathleen, can you just say a little bit more about that? Like using a prefab manufacturer, or?
Not sure where Kathleen is on. There she is.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, we're just looking at ways to create housing of a certain quality quickly. And so we have looked at and we've spoken to, there's down the coast, there are manufacturers who do the whole thing. They bring it to the town, they construct it, they deal with permitting. And I'm just wondering if that type of housing development, we have access to some land. I'm not sure how to structure the partnership, but I wondered if it has to be new construction or new prefab.
No, that's a great question. So our mandate is speed to construction, and actually one of the things we're going to be measured on by government is how many innovative housing methods we're using to get there, and offsite manufacturing is one of those methods. So yeah, that's absolutely fine. I think probably feel free to send me an email afterwards with a bit more detail. We want to make sure that there's a fair and transparent procurement process, so that if you've got land and it's zoned, you may want to, you can run your own procurement, or you can use the Housing Development Opportunities page to make sure that you're getting, and you can even say, we're looking for prefabricated housing, and then that would be a really interesting competition to see the folks on the coast who you've been talking with, and others who may be able to come and bring that offsite manufactured housing. So absolutely, that's right up our alley.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Lisa, the next question we have here is from Rita, and it's, does BC Build support seniors housing or only family homes?
We're agnostic as to the kind of housing that we support, as long as the rents can cover the operating costs of the building. So if there are seniors who can pay half decent rents, maybe let's go with, to follow my presentation, retired nurses or teachers or others who aren't low income seniors, who can afford, market or close to market rents. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. It's the BC builds its rental supply for middle income British Columbians, but they can be 25 or 75 or 80. It's more the financial model of the building rather than who the housing is being built for. Oh, someone's asking if we can close the slide deck.
There we go. Thank you, Caitlin. Okay. Do we have any other questions while we have Lisa here? And one of the Councillor Isaacson.
Thank you, Lisa. Maybe a question for both you and Naomi, if Naomi's still on the call. Say in a smaller community with maybe quote unquote limited land, or trying to prioritize where to focus first. How do you, for a nonprofit or a municipality that's trying to balance which direction to go in, approaching the Community Housing Fund versus BC Builds, do you have any suggestions as to which approach to take? Because we have need for both rentals and market rentals, and also some of the more supported housing. So how might that decision-making process look like, or any suggestions?
Yeah, certainly. So a couple different ways that you could look at it. Lisa and I have partnered on a couple of projects. So one avenue is coming into the Community Housing Fund, and if it's not successful, it's always, we look to see if it's an option for BC Builds. You can bifurcate a project, Councillor Isaacson, so that there is a combination of Community Housing Fund and BC Builds. It does take a little bit of work because both of them have to have individual mortgages or first place mortgages. So they have to end up having two separate legal structures. It's not impossible. It just requires a little bit of work to do it. And a nonprofit is willing to have that kind of administrative oversight of having two mortgages to pay. But that's not impossible. So you don't necessarily have to choose. I think the site might also dictate. So, Lisa, what are the criteria that you're looking for, do you think, in terms of unit count to sort of make something work?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're doing some small projects that are 20 units, but they have substantial equity contributions from other entities, in some cases, the regional district and the federal government. So like like communities that are like Gibson's is a good example. Nelson's a good example. You know, we can do smaller buildings. I think that the challenge of trying to fit BC Builds and the Community Housing Fund together is that one works on an ongoing intake and a rolling process, and the other is a call for proposals. However, having said that, you know, if you're gearing up for the next call for proposals and you think that there's a project that could be a BC Builds and Community Housing Fund combo, I would say let's have that BC Builds conversation really early on, so that when you're submitting your Community Housing Fund application, Naomi knows that there's a possibility for at least a portion of this building to be BC Builds, and that the numbers kind of work. And then that would probably actually strengthen a CHF application, I would imagine.
Thanks for that, Lisa. I see we've got 3 people next. So I've got Kathy, if you'd like to let Lisa know your question, followed by Kathleen, and then our mayor. So Kathy, I'm not sure if your question, if you haven't unmuted yet, is can BC Builds be used for mixed income seniors rental housing?
Only if mixed is 80% of units at market and 20% of units at 20% below market. That really is the BC Builds formula. If groups can bring other equity to the table, then we can have conversations about more units at below market or more units at deeper below market. But basically our grant funding gets 20% of units to 20% below market. However, we are very happy to stack capital with other funders. So, you know, if, for example, there's a seniors building or program or entity that would be able to put some of their own money into the project to get, you know, let's say 30% of units to 30% below market, or if they can bring the Affordable Housing Fund from CMHC to the table. So our capital stack can get 20% of units to 20% below market, but we're very open to working with other funders. Some municipalities have housing funds, some regional districts do. So basically the more money that can come to the table, the deeper the affordability can go, but BC Builds money can only get 20% of units to 20% below.
Thanks, Lisa. Kathleen from Press, would you like to read your question out?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you're open to, and it sounds like you might be, to alternative housing, rental housing models such as co-living.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. I will.
Okay, thank you. And our mayor, Ron Wasno, would you like to ask your question? I think I saw your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. So we have 160 city-owned properties in Powell River, and we're going through trying to get a consensus on developing some of these. Question is, if we have a parcel of land and we don't know what the servicing capabilities currently is or what the cost would be, would we have to get that work done before we approach BC Housing?
Yeah, I think we'd want you to know what the servicing costs are, because that's a huge factor in any development. So you wouldn't necessarily have to have a funding strategy in place for the servicing costs, although that certainly helps. But yes, unless Naomi has a different answer, we'd need to know what the servicing costs are. And my recommendation would be to start with the low hanging fruit, start with the sites that make sense, that have servicing, get some early wins to demonstrate to your community. And then there may be more support for spending additional capital to service lots once the community sees the kind of housing that can unlock.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would
Thank you.
say similarly, Mayor Wasnow, that under the Community Housing Fund, it's a pretty robust package that you have to submit. So you're submitting a full capital budget. So get an idea of, what are the servicing costs associated with that nominal land, to be able to sort of judge what's the benefit of it. And I would echo Lisa's comments around trying to use the service sites first, particularly because it will increase your affordability long term.
Thank you.
Okay, so Lisa, we have another question from Susan Hogarth. What about the provision of substance-free housing? And Susan, if you're available to speak more to that. I think, Susan, this question is both to Lisa and Naomi.
I think just me.
Okay.
I think that you're specifically talking about the supportive housing model and whether we would consider a model that was sober living. So I would just say it would be very challenging to have a building that's a rental building under the Residential Tenancy Act that does not allow people to consume legal substances in the BC Builds portfolio. Essentially, our sort of first analysis is if you're the only game in town, so you have one supportive housing building in Powell River, and the needs show that the folks that need to be housed are presenting with a complex needs and concurrent disorders that include substance use, and that we would expect that to be available and people be able to be still in active addiction. Once we add to the continuum in a community, we can start having a broader conversation about working with your outreach providers, working with Vancouver Coastal Health, your referral team, who is it that make up this population and who is it that needs housing. So I really want to align with who the community is and who needs housing. But I do see the idea of being able to create a bit more of a continuum. So being able to move folks through the housing to be able to move forward with their lives. So certainly would be something that we would look at.
Okay. Thanks, Naomi. I see that Susan's followed up with the term recovery housing and keeping those in recovery safe. And I do know that we have at least one nonprofit that's involved in substance use and treatment, but not necessarily housing. But thank you. Okay, another one from Delith. Harper, does co-locating with other non-housing services in these bills slow down the construction and or the development process in communities that have done that?
That is an excellent question. Not in the BC Builds model when we bring everyone in at the beginning. So a couple of and even with the childcare example that I gave. So I guess it can, and this is where municipalities are really the heroes of BC Builds. So I'll just go back to the Gibsons example. So that was Gibsons had set aside this land. They'd started to design a building. They heard about BC Builds. They got in touch. They said, is this a good BC Builds project? We said, let's look at the numbers. Yes, it looks good. And so then, and this was again, last July, I went up there. By December, we had a good building designed, ready to go for BC Builds approvals, financial approvals. And then the mayor wanted to add childcare, and they had a nonprofit developer already as a partner. So the developer said, okay, let's get my architect to work over the Christmas holidays and see what they can do. Came back to us literally in January and had childcare kind of revise the plans, put childcare in. And it would have slowed things down if it weren't for the municipal staff. And of course, they have a vested interest because it's their land and their council's given them direction to build housing. But they turned around a development permit, a modified development permit really, really quickly. So again, when we've got everyone at the table in these project steering committees and we're all rowing in the same direction at the same pace, it doesn't slow things down. Same with the City of North Vancouver project. It's a municipal project. They want a neighborhood house on the bottom floor. It's definitely way more complicated, like way, way, way more complicated to put something on the bottom floor and housing on top. But the work we've been doing so far, as long as everyone's on the same page as much as possible, the Gibson thing was a bit of a miracle to be able to work childcare in. It's not ideal. We'd want to have known at the outset what's going where. So it doesn't take longer, but it's definitely more work. But my perspective is that it's worth the work. And then also the housing people get exposed to what it takes to build a childcare or a fire hall or a city hall. So it's kind of cool.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And we'll
Can I just add on to, I just want to add on to that just because we have so BC Housing is a construction lender. So either program takes access of a credit line that we facilitate from Treasury Board. And so one of the pieces is around the size of the non-residential. That is a challenge as well. So we can only finance a certain percentage of both capital and square footage. We're not created to actually compete with private sector financing. So that's just a piece too. So in terms of how the construction is financed and or how takeout financing is structured at the end, that can create some challenges. So just there's a bunch of moving pieces. It's not just coming to the table, it's also how it's going to get paid for. I think that's really critical in terms of milestones and everything. And so that can kind of hold up approvals if that piece hasn't been ironed out.
Yeah, and just to add, oh, sorry, Lisa, just add one more thing. Yeah, just to Naomi's point, and this is, I think, an important consideration for BC Builds, and I think it is the same because it's the same financing. And also this is true for CMHC, so it's great that there's this alignment. No more than 30% of a building can be non-residential. So that's across BC Builds and BC Housing and CMHC. So that's, just important, which is, that's a lot of space. That's, almost a third of a building, but that's definitely a consideration.
Okay, so Lisa, we'll take 2 more questions just so we give you time to get onto your next piece, and then also Elizabeth. I see that Daniel asked, could we offer treatment for substance misuse on the main 20 to 30% and act as landlords for the upper units? So it's 3 questions up in the chat box.
I think that's more a question for Naomi.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, ultimately, you're gonna, if you were providing recovery or treatment on the ground floor and people are living above, it's just how that treatment would be funded, right? That's not a housing service. That would have to come from the health authority. So certainly flexible in terms of what does the model look like. Also keeping in mind that it is people's homes. And so, we want to have like a good fit in terms of what the non-residential space is.
Thank you. And the next question, I think, is actually a city one. Caroline is asking about permissive tax exemption. So Caroline, that's one for me to follow up on. I must admit, I'm not fully sure of the answer for you on this one and what the history has been and where we're at. So Caroline, I know who you are, and I think that's a follow-up for me directly with our finance staff. And then if need be coming,
that, Lisa, sorry. I want to know too, because it's putting the society in a bit of jeopardy in terms of
okay.
I was going to ask you that offline too.
Yeah, it's a significant increased cost, so it really does need to be followed up on. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And I know that, and I think this is a question too for my CFO, and then also ultimately council if it's something that I've missed that requires a council directive. So with that, I'd like to thank Lisa. Thank you so much. I know you have to drop off in a few minutes, but you might be able to see the beginning of Elizabeth's presentation. So thank you very much for your presence. And I also want to say to the 3 presenters, we got you up here fairly quickly more by teams because coordinating for you to come here. But I do think that there is an opportunity for all the interested parties to get together for a housing social and meet each other. And because there's a lot of partnerships that can happen between faith groups who are interested in working with a nonprofit, who are, and all those synergies. We have people sitting silently and quietly. I also want to acknowledge that we have Stu Clark, who's the new director of, I've gotten your name wrong, Stu, your title, but Paklahaman. So again, still give you away there. Naomi already knows him really well, but we have a number of people who are not only partners for the federal and provincial government, but for each other in this Zoom room or Teams room. So, okay, thank you. So Lisa, if you drop off before we get to say goodbye to you, thank you so much. And we hope to see you in person in Powell River.
Yeah, thanks very much. And Elizabeth, I've seen your presentation with some of your colleagues, and yeah, I really thank you for the partnership that we have with CMHC. It's incredible. And yeah, and Lisa, thanks for organizing for me to be here today.
You're welcome. Okay, so Elizabeth, you're up next, and let me know if you're able to share, and if you're not, Caitlin.
It looks like I have the share button available now. So just let me try to see if I can share the screen. Yeah, I'll put that in presentation mode. Just bear with me.
Do you notice Elizabeth has the tidiest office ever?
Yeah. It's the background. Interesting that I'm not seeing my
We can see your screen when you went to full presentation mode just a second ago. We could see it.
Yeah, but I interesting that I'm not seeing my own notes. And okay, would it be possible to still have Caitlin control the slide and so that I can see my notes? So sorry about that.
No problem. Caitlin, are you able to pull up Elizabeth's slide? Here we go.
Yeah, just one moment here.
Thank you. And I just want to say thanks to Caitlin, who's been a stellar support in the background.
I think I can see my notes now. So sorry about that. Can you still see the full screen of my slide? Or it this sorry for the confusion.
I can
we can see a full screen. Yeah.
Okay. So that will work. Okay. So thank you again, Lisa. And I also like to thank the City of Powell River for hosting this webinar. You are providing such a great opportunity for us to connect with your community. And to the next slide. I'm speaking from Burnaby, BC today. And I wanted to acknowledge that I live, work, learn, and play on the traditional unceded territory of the Coastal Salish nations of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish. I'm thankful for this land and appreciate its many generations of caretakers. As many of you have known, the National Housing Strategy was announced in 2017. It keeps people, communities, and partnerships at the forefront. All of the strategies, policies, and programs are designed to respect the vision that housing is more than just a roof over our heads. So with these in consideration, the National Housing Strategy has been designed as a toolkit, featuring complementary initiatives working together to address challenges across the housing continuum and the spectrum of housing needs. So these initiatives are to help the creation of new housing supply, the modernization of existing housing stock, resources for community housing providers, and the funding for housing innovation and research. So this chart is showing CMHC offers an array of products for different development phases, from seed funding for pre-development to the various initiatives for construction development. So our suite of programs spans all housing types, the seed funding affordable housing fund and the commercial mortgage loan insurance we offer have a much broader span to support a wide range of housing types. While the apartment construction loan program, formerly it was called the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, is a supply initiative for new construction of purpose-built rental apartments. For the majority of our programs, eligible proponents include, but are not limited to, community housing sector. That includes nonprofit housing organizations and housing co-ops, municipal governments, provincial and territorial governments and their agencies, indigenous governments and their organizations, and also private sector partners. All of our programs in the general sense follow this prioritization criteria in supporting populations that are in the greatest housing need. Projects must have a minimum of 5 affordable housing units or beds, and also include a depth and a duration of affordability, access to transit and amenities, accessibility, and energy efficiency. And these criteria are minimums, and funding applicants may also be rewarded with financing incentives for exceeding these minimum mandatory requirements. So these incentives include access to lower interest rates, lower equity requirements, longer amortization period, lower DCR, and the longer loan terms. CMHC undertakes regular reviews of our programs and the products to ensure they remain relevant given the changing dynamics in the housing sector. We want to ensure that the government investment is focused on increasing housing supply and restoring affordability levels for Canadians. So recently, we introduced the changes to our most popular programs and the products, like our seed funding, affordable housing fund, and MLI Select. In June, we launched the Co-op Housing Development Program, which is the newest addition to our program spectrum, featuring the largest investment in co-op housing in the last 30 years. We also plan to announce changes to the apartment construction loan program in the fall, especially to do with the Canada Builds that was announced in the 2024 federal budget. How to leverage the mechanism through the apartment construction loan program to encourage the provincial and the territorial governments to launch their own ambitious housing plans, modeled after BC Builds that Lisa just introduced. So for today's discussion, I will walk you through these highlighted programs with a focus on new construction. If you're interested in other programs you see here, or if you are interested in financial support for preserving and retrofitting existing buildings, please feel free to contact me after this session. So let's start with the seed funding. The seed funding has been designed to provide contributions or loans or a combination of both to assist with the planning costs of building a new affordable housing project. Through the preservation stream, the seed funding can also provide contributions to help preserve existing community housing projects so that they remain viable and sustainable. Some of you may have known that the seed funding application portal was closed for the large part of 2023 due to the backlog of applications exceeding available budget last year. So when we reopened the portal in March this year, the funding demand was again overwhelming. And in less than 10 weeks, we committed all funding in the contribution stream. So as of now, we don't know if the budget for the contribution stream will be augmented in this budget cycle, but we are still accepting applications for interest-free loans. So when we closed the seed funding application portal, we took the time to redesign some elements of the program. So now the new seed is offered based on an incremental stage approach, following the project development stages that are concept development, pre-design, schematic development, and the design development. We also simplified the questions for applicants to answer on the application portal. And these are some examples of scenarios for each funding stage. If you're familiar with seed funding, you may recall that in the past, we would only consider applications at stage 2, sometimes stage 3. We required that applicants have secured the use of land and have completed primary concept development, that they knew how many units they were going to build. And many applicants indicated to us that to get to stage 2 required a lot of resources, and nonprofits often just couldn't fund the work and activities on their own. So we modified the seed funding to bridge this funding gap. So now, even if you only have an idea of where to build your project, but you haven't leased or acquired the land, we would still consider your application for seed funding. With that, we have also expanded activities that will be eligible for the use of seed funding. For example, options to purchase site assessment can now be funded through seed funding. There are no mandatory environmental and accessibility criteria for seed funding, but if you also consider to apply for other CMHC funding programs, you can use the seed funding to prepare your project and align its social outcomes with the requirements of these programs. And many seed funding applicants aim to apply for the Affordable Housing Fund, which is the flagship initiative of the National Housing Strategy. Last November, the 2023 Fall Economic Statement announced the renaming of the National Housing Co-Investment Fund to the Affordable Housing Fund, with an additional funding of $1 billion over 3 years, starting next year in 2025-2026, to build more affordable housing. We are planning to announce reforms to the Affordable Housing Fund this year. And before that, you may hear us use Affordable Housing Fund, or its acronym AHF, and a co-investment fund interchangeably. This is because funding is still available under the current co-investment fund. There are 2 streams of the program: the new construction stream and the housing repair and the renewal stream for the preservation and the revitalization of existing community housing. It also offers initiatives carved out of the funding program to support Canadians in greatest housing need. So one of these initiatives or special carve-outs included the one that we just wrapped up. It's to support Indigenous communities for transitional housing for populations escaping gender-based abuse. So that was a joint program or carve-out with Indigenous Services Canada. And they would subsidize the operating of these properties, while CMHC provided funding to capital costs of these projects. Community and affordable housing projects are eligible for Affordable Housing Fund. And other project types can also be mixed-use market and affordable rental housing, shelters, transitional and supportive housing. conversion of non-residential buildings to housing use, renovation of existing affordable units which will otherwise be abandoned or demolished, and also support for Indigenous community housing. And the applications for Affordable Housing Fund must meet the minimum mandatory requirements for financial viability, affordability, energy efficiency, and accessibility. For financial viability, applicants must demonstrate their financial and operational ability to carry out the project, their capacity to deal with development risks, such as cost overruns and the delays in construction. They must also demonstrate the financial viability of the proposed project itself, that the rents it generates will be able to cover costs. Affordability, proponents will keep at least 30% of the units rented below 80% of median market rent. They must maintain this affordability level for a minimum of 20 years. For energy efficiency, new projects must achieve a 25% decrease in energy consumption and the greenhouse gas emissions relative to the 2015 National Building and Energy Codes. While for renewal projects, there has to be a 25% reduction in energy consumption and the GHG emissions relative to the pre-repair. And for accessibility, there are two options, either to have 20% of units within the project meet or exceed local accessibility standards, with common areas being barrier-free, or you incorporate universal designs throughout the project. And partnerships are a central feature of the Affordable Housing Fund. And this program was called a co-investment fund, which implies that other investors will be involved, that federal funding must be supplemented by investments from another level of governments. And in BC, BC Housing is a typical co-investor, and many AHF applicants also applied for BC Housing's CHF and or IHF. CMHC and the BC Housing have been meeting regularly. We worked on how to better align the co-investment fund and the CHF, IHF funds. So I include this step-by-step guide for your reference. And this guide was developed last fall, so you still see the old acronym of co-investment fund, the National Housing Co-investment Fund, NHCF, in the document. And this diagram is based on the assumption that the proposed project meets the social outcomes for both CMHC and the BC Housing Funding Program. We also assume that the project has been approved to proceed under the CHF, IHF RFP, and then anticipate that CMHC is the primary lender, providing the repayable loan through Affordable Housing Fund, and the BC Housing is the subordinate lender, providing a mix of forgivable loan and operating subsidy. The Affordable Housing Fund boosts funding in the form of forgivable loans to help offset the continually rising development cost that has made the project's viability difficult to achieve. Eligible projects can access a base funding up to $25,000 per unit. The projects may also qualify for the premium for higher affordability up to $25,000 per unit if they can have 40% of units rented below 70% of median market rent. They may also qualify for the premium for higher energy performance of $25,000 if they can further reduce their energy use and the GHG emissions by another 10% over the minimum requirement. The maximum boost funding available per unit is $75,000. And since 2018, we have funded projects across Canada through the Co-Investment Fund or AHF. Project types range from new construction of shelters and transition houses, new housing for elders, seniors, and veterans to renovation of existing co-op units. And many funded projects also received seed funding to help with their pre-construction or pre-renovation planning activities. So very quickly, this is a project in Souk. It's developed and operated by Macola Housing to provide 75 affordable rental homes. And 13 units in this building are rented at the BC shelter rate for people with very low incomes. The project opened its door in 2023 in October. Indigenous community individuals, seniors, and families are prioritized. Non-Indigenous residents are also welcome. So this project prioritized the community needs and also demonstrated strong partnerships between the three levels of governments. This project was funded by BC Housing, by CMHC through the Co-Investment Fund, and also received the funding from the Capital Regional District.
Elizabeth, I'm not sure if there was a slide. There we go. We missed the slide.
So sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. So just showing the one of the project funded by all three levels of government and with the housing developers and operators' own equity. So up next is the apartment construction loan program, which was rental construction financing initiative before the name change. So it's a rental housing supply initiative to fund the construction of new purpose-built rental housing, which will be affordable to middle-class Canadians, especially in certain markets where owning a home is becoming increasingly less attainable. So through this funding program, we will provide low-cost repayable loans during the earliest stage of rental development. And the loans approved through this funding program include CMHC mortgage loan insurance, which can simplify loan renewals throughout the life of the mortgage. So this program can support construction of standard apartment projects only, and it does not support the construction of niche type housing such as retirement homes, single room occupancy, or student housing. So some unique benefits of this program. We talked about the low cost loans during the riskiest phases of financing development, from construction, rent up to stabilization. It delivers unique financing features such as fixed rate construction and the takeout loans. The rate is locked at first advance, providing the borrower with interest rate certainty from the onset. Mortgage loan insurance is in force from first to draw, with the premium at no extra cost to the borrower. Amortization period can be up to 50 years, and the program complements and is compatible with local affordable housing programs and initiatives. It also provides incentives for projects with great social outcomes, which is showing on this chart. That is to say that projects that pursue deeper affordability, higher environmental and accessibility performance, partnerships and inclusion will receive more points and be rewarded with higher loan to cost up to 100%. We also support the target rental housing market through our mortgage loan insurance products, like the MLI Select. The MLI Select encourages the preservation and the creation of affordable, accessible, and climate compatible units. MLI Select can support all project types eligible for our mortgage loan insurance for market rental housing, except for student housing. MLI Select uses a point system to offer insurance incentives for new construction and existing properties. Various tiers and associated benefits can be achieved through commitments to affordability, energy efficiency, and/or accessibility. The original point system for MLI Select, showing on this slide, would allow borrowers to choose to focus on a single area like affordability or energy efficiency to achieve the maximum points, which is 100% to access the best incentives. The MLI Select was launched in March 2022, and it has received a significant market acceptance. In last year alone, close to 60% of rental units we insured were through MLI Select. While the uptake was high, we have also seen the decline of applications through the affordability stream relative to those qualifying through the energy efficiency stream. With rent affordability continues to be a challenge across the country, we adapted the allocation of points for energy efficiency outcomes in order to encourage more affordability commitments. So starting June 19th, 2024, the social outcomes scoring for applications providing energy efficiency commitments is reduced from 30, 50, 100 points to 20, 35, and 50 points. We have also updated the accessibility stream to establish equivalence with the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification. So with these changes, we are able to improve alignment between energy efficiency and accessibility outcomes, which now have similar scoring benchmarks. So same changes have been introduced to refinancing of existing properties through MLI Select. We also recognize that there are projects that do not wish to pursue MLI Select, and I want to support those projects through our MLI for market rental product. So together, our MLI commercial product mix can continue to support targeted rental housing needs. We are enhancing appeal of MLI for market rental by increasing flexibilities. So also effective June 19th, the maximum allowable amortization period for new construction projects under MLI market rental is extended from 40 years to 50 years. So with these adjustments, clients will be able to access similar flexibilities that they would have benefited from the MLI Select. So lastly, I just wanted to spend a few minutes to introduce the new Co-op Housing Development Program, otherwise known as CHDP. The CHDP is an investment of $1.5 billion in the co-op housing sector. It includes $500 million in contribution funding and $1 billion in loans for the construction of new co-op housing projects. It's the largest investment in co-op housing sector in 30 years. So through this investment, we expect to create thousands of net new rental co-op units, which will foster the development of inclusive and strong communities for today and for generations to come. A portion of CHDP units will be targeted to priority populations under the National Housing Strategy, with 25% of program funding targeted to women and their children. The program will run over 4 years, starting in 2024 through to 2028, during which open calls for applications will be issued and funding will be provided to approve the projects. The first window will open actually next Monday, will remain open from July 15th to September 15th. The CHDP is geared to nonprofit housing co-ops, indigenous housing co-ops, indigenous governments and organizations in partnership with the co-op and the land trusts. Ownership co-ops or equity co-ops would not be eligible for funding. It's because these co-ops typically require an investment, and this investment, along with any profit earned, will be returned to co-op investors. The CHDP is geared to support new construction projects or turnkey projects. It can support densification projects or conversion of non-residential buildings to housing. Eligible projects must all be non-profit rental co-op housing and create net new housing units. So I talked about generally other programs only required a minimum of 5 units. But this is a major difference between the co-op housing development program with the other funding programs in the project size. If the project is located in a large urban center defined as a census metropolitan area, the minimum project size is 75 units. If it's in a small and a medium urban center, like Powell River, then it must have a minimum of 30 units. For projects located in rural or remote northern or indigenous communities, a 5-unit minimum size will apply, but we may consider fewer units on a case-by-case basis. So the funding application may include one or multiple buildings or properties and can include multi-site development to achieve minimum project size. The funding structure. We use industry standards to determine which costs are eligible use of fund under CHDP. So eligible expenses must be directly related to the construction of the project. So CHDP can cover both soft costs and hard costs. The total loans through CHDP, being forgivable and repayable loans combined, can cover up to 100% of eligible project costs. So I have just taken you through 5 funding programs in the broad stroke. So to recap, the seed funding assists with soft costs for planning and the preparation before your new construction or renovation project starts. The Affordable Housing Fund offers loans or contributions or a combination of both. It supports a wide spectrum of housing types for populations in greatest need. The Apartment Construction Loan Program targets middle-class renters in Canada. It provides low-cost insured loans for construction of new rental apartments. The mortgage loan insurance products for multi-unit housing can help lower the borrowing costs from approved lenders while supporting targeted market rental needs. Our new co-op housing development programs aims to create thousands of net new rental co-op units. It can fund up to 100% of eligible costs. So into the fall and probably as soon as in the next few weeks, we will be providing more updates on programs such as the Housing Accelerator Fund. So last week, we officially launched the second round of Housing Accelerator Fund. Starting next week, we will be offering info sessions, one-on-one meetings, and application support for those eligible to apply. We will also be introducing reforms and the changes to elements under the Affordable Housing Fund and the Apartment Construction Loan Program. We will also be issuing open calls for proposals for programs under the National Housing Strategy Research and Innovation Stream. So these programs are to support capacity development of the nonprofits housing sector, to support social innovations and the demonstration of best practice. So a lot's going on. A simple way to stay up with us is to sign up for the CMHC housing updates. So when we release new programs, new funding opportunities, housing research and the market insights, you will get an email alert. So thank you so much. I'll give the mic over back to Lisa.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. That was a lot of really great information. And I actually was about to ask if you had a sign up. So that's perfect. That will allow everybody here to get those updates as they need it from you. So we have about time for about 2 questions, and then we'll have to wrap up right just before 11 because some of us have another meeting. So the first one we have is, I believe, from Lisa, I think it's a Lisa Moffat, and it's about how does CMHC define proximity to transit for smaller communities? Because our context is quite different than, say, Vancouver or Prince George.
Definitely. So we want to offer as much flexibility as possible for small rural communities. And these considerations have been integrated into the design of our newest programs, including the co-op housing development program, because we've been criticized that the past programs disadvantaged small and the rural communities. So definitely present your project ideas to us as early as possible, and we will discuss what type of flexibility we can offer. We definitely will take regional context into consideration when evaluating your proposals.
Thank you. And then the next one is, can the seed funding be used for BC Housing or BC Builds initiative?
The quick answer is yes. So generally, the funding programs you see in the table I was showing, they are stackable, especially seed funding.
Okay.
So they are not only stackable among other CMHC fundings, they are also stackable with funding offers from BC Housing and sometimes from other federal organizations like FCM, Federation of Canadian Municipalities. They also offer Planning Fund, which was designed around our seed funding, and also the co-investment fund to maximize the possibility of layering.
Okay, perfect. And then one last question. This one's from Rita. Would CMHC be more likely to support an affordable housing fund application for a project that was also supported through seed funding in pre-development?
That's a great question, and definitely. So we don't prescribe that seed funding applicants have to move on to other CMHC funding programs, primarily for affordable housing. But what we have seen is that more and more seed funding applicants use that as planning resources to help align or prepare their funding proposals for next stage. So going to either Affordable Housing Fund or even for BC Housing CHF or IHF.
Thank you. And our last question over to Councillor Isaacson.
Thank you. You mentioned the Housing Accelerator Fund and a second round opening soon. We weren't successful, the City of Powell River, in the first round, and I'm wondering if the criteria or the description will change in the second iteration.
Great question. I believe we have already reached out to your city staff to let them know that you are eligible to reapply, and that there will be resources and assistance provided. They have updated the some requirements. We encourage applicants to look at the top 10 best practices that are extracted from the first round of successful applicants, and also the initiatives you are proposing in your action plan. The majority or most of them must be new, like for small, in the small rural stream, 3 out of 5 initiatives must be new. If you are for large urban centers, then 4 out of 7 initiatives must be new.
Okay. Thank you. And I think we plan on keeping in very close contact with Elizabeth and her colleagues, and actually planning staff like Jason Gao, who's sitting in the background, by the way, have been. So we have, so I just thought I'd quickly go through some next steps. So we'll share this web recording. We'll share all the PowerPoints, and then it might take us a little while to set up a social of sorts. So stay tuned for that, because I think our local people, and I think we'd like to see, Naomi fortunately does come up frequently in person, but I don't know that we would necessarily, if we could get Elizabeth and Lisa and others, I think that would be fantastic. And then it would allow all of you who have maybe some direct questions or want to connect with them in person, an opportunity to do that. But there's nothing stopping you in between from reaching out directly to BC Housing and CMHC, and then also connecting with each other. So if there happens to be a faith group, a developer, a landowner, and you've got some ideas that you want to start talking about before you look at these opportunities, really encourage you to do that. That's the benefits of being part of a smaller community. I think probably most people in this Teams room know each other, except for me. So I think, and then you also have like our counselors who are good bridge builders across organizations, just because of their length of time in community. So with that, I don't know if Councillor Isaacson or the Mayor want any last words before we just shut this down. Okay, well, raise my hands to all of you and help me just say thank you to our presenters. And thank you all for attending. Okay, so stay tuned for follow-up.
Everyone.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Enjoy the summer. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth.